The narratives that you are about to see are fictionalized scenarios. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The Use Case 5 narrative demonstrates FAA requests for USS-held data, remote ID display of temporary flight restriction or TFR approval, and federal public safety requests for correlation queries. In Part 1 of this scenario, the remaining post-storm UAS activities progress with minimal incident. The agricultural and environmental surveys gather the necessary data, substantial imagery is captured for the evening news, Henry and his family are successfully extracted from Plum Creek, and Bill and Anna close out their live stream with a whopping 243,000 views on Instagram. The local news media are both annoyed and begrudgingly grateful for the extra footage. 2 days later, Officer Howard receives a call from the Federal Emergency Management Agency expressing interest in the drone operations the day of the storm. He works with FEMA to submit a request to the Federal Aviation Administration for a historical query, which gathers limited UAS data from operations over a select period of time. However, the media drones and the recreational hobbyists were not using a USS, so they will not appear on the FAA's historical query. Officer Howard will only receive historical data for the drones that were connected to USSs, and the information will be limited to location, time, and identification numbers. Personal identification information is not provided in response to a historical query, but the limited information is sufficient for Blacksburg public safety authorities to work with FEMA and share lessons learned with other municipalities facing natural disasters. In Part 2, just as Officer Howard gets his ducks in a row and the town feels like things are getting back to normal, something strange occurs in the airspace over Blacksburg. Local law enforcement observes an unexpected drone flying over the Virginia Tech football stadium, where an active temporary flight restriction, or TFR, remains in place for the next big game against the University of Virginia Cavaliers. At the same time, yet another unexpected drone accidentally flies into a TFR that's been established over the Radford Army ammunition plant in preparation for a VIP visit from the Pentagon. Law enforcement and public safety officials initiate efforts to identify the drone. But it's important to note that while an FAA historical query returns information about legitimate UAS operations in the area earlier that day, it reveals nothing in terms of the operator of the mystery drone or its intent. Identifying the drones over the football stadium will require a different approach, the correlation query. A correlation query provides identifying data that includes detailed information about the UAS and its operator. Only an authorized official can initiate a correlation query. With this in mind, federal officials at Radford quickly use remote ID to get more details about the anonymous drone overhead and initiate the correlation query. The query reveals that the mysterious drone is operated by a recreational hobbyist who inadvertently maneuvered into the TFR over Radford. The federal officials are then able to contact the hobbyist to mitigate the risk and prevent further incident. But what of the suspicious drone over the Virginia Tech football stadium? The lack of a broadcast remote ID for this UAS led law enforcement to deploy direction-finding equipment, allowing them to identify the culprits. UVA students, the embittered rivals of Virginia Tech Hokies, engaging in a collegiate prank before the next football game.
So use case 5 is an important demonstration of access by authorized officials to the data that they need to enforce laws.
One of the highlights that we wanted to showcase and explore and evaluate is that once an entity is able to access that remote ID information and that ID itself off of the aircraft, we wanted to provide an app or a way for authorized entities with elevated privileges based on policy decisions that are to be determined will be able to ascertain an additional set of information. This set of information includes that held by the FAA in various databases, such as the drone registration database, the pilot certification database, the low authorization and notification capabilities database, to provide these authorized entities a holistic picture with data correlated to the remote ID that they have received from an aircraft. We're looking to address the feedback that we've gotten from a security perspective in order to enable those that have the authorization to go and take the necessary actions based off of a remote ID and the information held within the FAA.
In this scenario, we are mimicking what really happens here at Virginia Tech every time we have a football game and we have a temporary flight restriction. And there have been instances where our public safety officials here, as many across the country have witnessed, where they see drones in the area that aren't supposed to be there. A real concern that we're trying to address here is providing the information that public safety officials need in order to enforce the rules. In this case, the remote ID features of these aircraft are going to be able to provide information to appropriate authorities as to whether or not the aircraft actually has authorization or a waiver to be in that temporary flight restriction. Once the law enforcement officer has that initial piece of identifying information about that aircraft, they're able to provide that to the appropriate FAA officials, at which time the FAA can reference that information against other databases that will give insight into the aircraft, its registration, the pilot, and its pilot certification. This is the information that officials would be able to utilize to track down and understand the intent and whether or not it was nefarious or not. A pretty key capability for our public safety officials. Remote ID displays, as they're currently evolving now, serve a number of functions. And we're talking about displays on phones or tablets that allow the user to either input a geographic area and to interrogate or to understand what UAS are operating in that region, and to show other airspace features that are relevant to their interest in understanding the access or lack of access for that drone in that particular region. So RAD displays would provide information such as where is a TFR or a temporary flight restriction. The remote ID display is going to pull all of this together to allow law enforcement and the public to understand where the UAS is flying and to be able to retrieve some information to identify those UAS and whether or not they indeed have the appropriate authorizations to be flying in that restricted area. We've talked some about remote ID displays, and the way I look at that is that's really a real-time tool to look at a drone that's actively flying in an area and allow the public and law enforcement to obtain some information about that flight. In contrast to that, you might imagine a scenario where an individual sees a drone that's maybe not behaving as they might expect and causes them some concern. By the time they get back to their house or get to a phone to notify authorities that they had concern about a particular UAS, that UAS may no longer be in the air. So UTM and the traffic management system that we're testing is looking to evaluate a feature that we refer to as historical query. The purpose of the historical query is to support resolution of the use case that I just mentioned, which would involve the officer that was notified of this potential drone. It would allow them to basically draw a geographic area and specify a time that was provided to them by the witness. And it would allow them to retrieve information about flights that were in that area during that time.